Hello and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival and today's program, Ayad Akhtar, Homeland Elegies. My name is Margarita Riesberg. I'm a program manager at CHF. You can learn more about upcoming events at chicagohumanities.org and help support them by donating or becoming a member. Thanks to our captioner for making this event more accessible. All digital events have closed captioning which can be controlled through YouTube. You can learn more about accessible services at chicagohumanities.org/access. This program is generously underwritten by Anita and Prabhakant Sinha. It is presented in partnership with PEN America. Please help me welcome Eboo, Patel, and Ayad Akhtar.
Hello to the Chicago Humanities Festival. I am thrilled to be here with my friend Ayad Akhtar. I want to say that the moment of silence we did at the top of this program was deeply meaningful to me about the life of Breonna Taylor, about the times in which we live. And while we must be in reverent silence, we must also say her name and the names of all of those who have been lost in this brutal time of police violence, particularly against Black and brown bodies. It is very important for me to personally begin the program on this day with that. That is a personal sentiment of mine, and I'm grateful for this platform to be able to express that. Ayad, that is in some way a fitting bridge into a novel about the times, about tumultuous times, a novel that I felt when I read it captured not just a moment, but an era and a nation in transformation. And I want to thank you for writing it, for offering light and clarity through a cacophonous novel with many voices and many tensions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, introduction, if you will. I mean, yeah, it's a complicated time. The country is in disarray, and that was what I wanted to do, or what I felt incumbent. It felt like life or death, to be honest, Eboo. It felt like I had to write the book. And once it started coming out of me, it was just I was a person possessed for 11 months, really. And I was startled by I was writing into a kind of blind present, if you will, and I was startled by the coherency of the book at the end of the day. I mean, it was just so coherent. Considering how it came together, it was hard to explain how that happened, but I think it speaks to having seen a picture of this country riven by divides, rural against urban, and heartland against the coast, economic, racial, and how those things have been fueled by a shift in our ideology around money, and how money has enabled the individualism of our country, as funneled through finance, has enabled the despoiling and the pulling apart of our nation, which we're now seeing in, relief, as we're seeing so clearly because of the pandemic. I think maybe before the pandemic it was a little bit harder to see, not that much harder, but a little bit harder.
Right.
And I think, my mom had passed away. My dad was, had made a mess of things, and he was showing very clear signs of decline, and Trump was elected, and I had to write the book. So
I think, if I remember correctly, I think I was in New York. I think it was 2017, 2018. We had breakfast at the coffee shop at Lincoln Center, and you took me backstage at the theater where I think it was Junk was going on. It was going up in a month or two, and it was it was, this trauma was unfolding in your mind, and
at that time
you made art of it, right? You made art of it, and I think that's the most remarkable thing. A type of art that is highly accessible to the moment. I mean, it's a compulsively readable novel, and one that I think to myself, this is, I held this up at dinner today with my 10 and 13-year-old, right? And, they started rolling their eyes before I even opened my mouth, which just means I'm a dad. And I'm like, you will be reading this in graduate school. Like, some professor will hand it to you and say, if you want to know what the early 21st century was like, read this novel. And I will tell you that he is my friend, that you will care that he is my friend. So let's, I wanna kind of move into a little bit of your process. And as we joked about,
just say a little word about the book for folks who maybe don't know anything about it, just to give them a little bit of context, and then we jump into the process.
Absolutely.
So basically, for those of you who haven't read it, I'm sure most of you probably haven't. It's a very unusual novel in the sense that it doesn't always read like a novel. Sometimes it reads like an essay, and sometimes it reads like a, like a memoir, and you're not quite always sure what it is. There's I believe, folks have said that there's a kind of organic coherency to it in the experience of reading it. The narrator has my name, many of the facts of my life, and I am sort of recounting all of these things. And fundamental tension is between me and my father. My father at the beginning of the book, who's a Trump supporter because he was Trump's doctor in the mid-90s and got to be friends with him, friends, if you will, and kind of has a positive feeling about him. And that sort of cascades into a kind of political exploration of what's happened to America. And at times, I'm telling the story of an artist who is coming of age in America and who achieves a kind of American dream. It gets seduced by success and all of that. And at the same time, I'm also riffing in musical form on lots of different themes: debt, antitrust, racial politics, the aftermath of 9/11, et cetera, right? And so all of these things are kind of coexisting in this ecosystem that is the book. One of the things that I was thinking about formally when I was writing the book was about social media, and how on social media there is all of this stuff, and it exists in a form that makes it coherent together. You can be looking at real estate listings and Cornel West's latest statement about Black Lives Matter and an article about the Kardashians, and it is all a kind of flow, a mental or conscious flow. And so that those toggling between those registers, whether it was Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, I wanted everything to kind of coexist in the same space, whether it was family drama, whether it was intimate, sexual dalliance, whether it was antitrust theory, whether it was Islamic finance, all of that sort of. So that just kind of gives you all a picture, hopefully, of something. So,
I think what's remarkable to me is I think that the novel could be summarized totally differently and also be entirely accurate. In other words, it is so wide ranging. It's the proverbial elephant, right? And even the author, you are, when you describe it in 3 paragraphs, you cannot help but simply describe a part of it because it's so wide ranging. In some ways, there's something of a Rushdie quality to it, right?
Yeah. And he's in it, by the way.
and it holds together. Permit the musical analogy here, right? But there's the Grateful Dead kind of famously jam through their songs in these kind of long flowing jams, but you always feel a coherence there. There's always a song there. And so as your novel ventures into a variety of territories, right? Yeah. Racial politics and finance, as you say, there's always this coherence, and it's this kind of manifold exploration of America, of what is America in the early 21st century. So, and we will get to some of those themes in just a moment, but I do want to begin with the process thing here. And as you and I joked, as we kind of did our pre-call, I always find process questions, a little bit strange to ask. Like it's a little bit like the reporter asking the great basketball player, what were you thinking when you got the ball with 4 seconds to go on the baseline, and you drove past 2 people and did a reverse? Like, what were you thinking? And you can just see the athlete, saying about thinking to himself or herself, I was playing. That's what I do, And so I think with writers, it's a little bit different because what I'm asking you to do is put into words in some kind of metaphor how it is you put the words between these covers together, right? But I read you earlier the great Chuck Close line that inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us, the professionals, we show up and get to work. All the best ideas come out of this process. They come out of the work itself, right? Yeah. So you've been a writer for a long time now. what does a day look like? What does a day in the life of Ayad Akhtar when he is writing look like?
I get up and I get coffee, and it's usually 7:30-ish. I get up, coffee, and the sort of usual internet distractions for 20 to 30 minutes. And I tend to start the day by reading a little bit. I have been, the last few years, I've been reading Shakespeare in the morning. I find, I talk too much about Shakespeare just because critics think you're trying to make yourself look better than you are, and audiences think they must mean you're interested in boring stuff because Shakespeare's boring. But anyway, whatever. I start with Shakespeare every morning. He gets my mind moving in the right way, gets language moving through my brain in the right way. And then I usually I'm writing by 9, I hope, and then write till about 2 if I can. And writing can look strange. It can look sometimes like staring at a wall. Most of the time in a flow, it looks like I'm typing, I'm retyping. And there's sort of a lot of, but my fiance, who's an actor and a director, she said, until I was with you, I didn't realize how much writing is not writing. So there is a fair amount of thinking that goes into, I do a lot of note carding. I have a big cork board above my desk. And I put cards up and I move stuff around, and doing a lot of research. Every day it's a 9 to 2. That's ideally what it is. And I try to work 6 days a week, but sometimes it just keeps going and I don't realize I'm 8 or 9 days in and I'm like, oh, wait, I forgot that I was supposed to take a day off. So, I'll generally work myself to a place where I can't really write anymore. Exhaustion is a weird thing when it comes to writing. It's very real. You really do get exhausted, and it sometimes does feel physical. I remember a wonderful friend and a wonderful screenwriter friend of mine, one of the most successful screenwriters in Hollywood. We were much younger, before he became very successful, he would talk about stamina, writing stamina, that he would do leg presses, because for him, if his legs in particular had more muscle, he was able to muscle through the day writing better.
Wow.
And I think there's an analogy there. I think there's a physiology to writing. Cynthia Ozick talks about it as psychically very toxic very toxic sort of thing that you do. And I think that's true. You're working with stuff that has a physiological effect that can be deleterious. So being in some kind of a shape and being able to move around, all of that, matters. So.
And what does after 2 p.m. look like?
Break, business. If I'm revising, then I will continue. Revising, I can do 8-9 hours a day, but I can't generate new material more than 3 or 4. And my word count, 1,200 words a day is a phenomenal word count. 700 is more likely to be, and the funny thing about a word count is that sometimes I'll make most of it within the first hour. It'll just come right out. And then you're kind of the last 10% or the last 20% or working back through that stuff. I think one of the things that's changed for me a lot as a writer over the years is patience. I've become a lot more patient. And I trust the process because I've been through it so many times.
Yeah.
I know that if I stop now, I'll pick up tomorrow and there will be something there for me to do. I know that. I didn't always know that when I was much younger. I mean, I remember there were days I'd work 17 hours straight. Because I was scared that if I shut my computer, I turned it off, that I wouldn't know where to pick it up and I wouldn't know what the next day would bring.
Yeah. If you went to sleep, you didn't know if you'd wake up with, yeah.
Yeah. And it turns out that the ideas I was so enamored with at that time were not even that good, right? That's the other thing that I've learned with time, is that trust is actually is really underrated. Trusting and not knowing as you go into the act is actually a much, much richer, more fertile, and ultimately more productive way to go about it. But you have to have the experience of knowing that even though you don't know what's ahead, if you sit down and do the work, as Chuck Close says, the best ideas come from doing the work. They don't come before doing the work. That's been my experience anyway.
So where did this idea come from? Did you begin with a scene? Did you begin with a relationship? Did you begin with a single line? Like what's the germ of Homeland Elegies?
My dad is the germ. When I was, so after I saw you in New York and we opened this show Junk in New York, and really, really ambitious, big show about American finance and ideology about money. And, it was a very complicated reception. I left and I went to the American Academy in Rome, and I was there for 2 months. And I'd been doing a lot of research about a court case that my dad had been through in Western Wisconsin, a malpractice suit where he was tried by a jury of his Wisconsin, fellow citizens. And I had done a lot of research, and I was thinking about writing a very short novel about immigrant doctor at the end of his career, sort of dealing with life in rural America and what it has meant for him to have spent his life here. And it was a third-person novel, a very simple, elegant sort of tale that I'd kind of mapped out. And I started to write, and it wasn't working. Something just wasn't clicking. The voice wasn't working. It just didn't. It wasn't interesting. I mean, it was not bad, but it just wasn't good. And so I kept trying. It was a couple weeks. Then I finally put it away. And I was reading. I was in Rome. I was reading Livy, and I was reading Machiavelli, and I was reading Tacitus, and I was reading Plutarch, and one night I was up, and I went down to the library at the American Academy, and I found a book of poems by Leopardi, an Italian poet from about 200 years ago. And I opened it to a poem. It's called To Italy. And it's Leopardi addressing his fellow Italian citizens, his fellow Italians, sort of trying to remind them of what they had been and what they had become. And I remember, you know, as I said earlier, my mom had passed away. My dad was in signs of decline. Trump had been elected. I just tried to tell this story about what I thought had happened to America, and folks didn't seem to be able to make much sense of it. And Newt Gingrich was across the street at the American Academy. I was like, this is crazy. And I thought to myself, in reading the Leopardi poem, I thought, would it be possible to address my fellow American citizens? Could I summon a voice? Was there a voice that would unify the us, if in no other way than just as a collective act of hearing, right? And of course, ridiculously pretentious thought. But I went to bed that night, I woke up the next morning, and the first sentence of this book was already coming out of me. And that's what began. And then the first chapter was about my father, but it was not about his court case, and it was about something else. And then it was about my mother, and then it was about my father again. And then it was about me, and then it was about all kinds of stuff. So I just kind of let it unfold. And it turned out, I think I told you earlier today on the call, it was the first time that it was almost like I had been accumulating content, fragments of stories, ideas, locutions, interpretations, textures, colors, words for 25 years. They had been in a pot, and that pot had been on the stove, and I didn't even know that it had been on the stove simmering for 25 years. And I suddenly discovered, and there it is, a stew almost fully formed. It was,
and that's how you do nehari, right? Like, think about how long that's got to cook for.
That's exactly
for the meat to be tender.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, there is a recipe for that in the book.
Right, there might actually be.
There is.
There might actually. What a great metaphor, actually, right? You know, I don't typically like. I mean, just thinking about this now, I like to think about the United States as a potluck dinner, not as a melting pot. But there's a lot of simmering together that happens in the United States, and I think that's and blending of flavors within a single dish, and the kind of tenderizing that occurs, and in part you're saying that in the 30 or 40 years you've been an artist, a bunch of things have cooked within your being, and you were able to serve up this really beautiful dish. You know?
Well, I think the way I put it to Alexander Schwartz in the New Yorker profile was that it was like a lifetime's kindling that I've been accumulating without realizing it, and then really my dad's story was the igniting spark that just set it all ablaze. So, you know, I sometimes worry that I had 3 or 4 different things that I probably could have broken this up into many different, you know, novels or whatever. But this was the way for this story and this response to our country to come out of me.
Yeah. I mean, there's you know, the classic Whitman line that he is wide and contains multitudes, right? So America is wide and contains multitudes. This novel is wide and contains multitudes. We human beings are wide. And part of what I think, as I said to you earlier, you are so perceptively brilliant at is the unlayering of our complexity, of human complexity, right? So in Disgraced, you see this, what seems like a 2-dimensional character in Amr, this, you know, brown guy who on the track to be a partner at a law firm who's so assimilated you would think he was white. Like, when's he going to change his name to Sam, right?
Yeah.
And then here comes the unlayering of his complexity. I think it is striking that it is in Rome that you get the germ of this idea from an Italian poet.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason I think that that's striking is because I think of you as not just as an American writer, but as a quintessential American writer of our moment. And in the New Yorker profile, it highlights how much time you've spent abroad, right? Everything from sitting with the women in Pakistan and the Punjab, like listening to their brilliance and their competitions amongst themselves and how they were when the men went hunting,
right?
To doing crazy things with avant-garde theater types on the continent, right? Yeah. You've spent a lot of time abroad, an intense time abroad. So tell me how that helped you become an American writer.
You know, I think it's a really perceptive insight. You know, when you shared that with me a little bit earlier today, I just thought, that's it. I never thought of that, but I think that's exactly right. That in a weird way, when I was a kid growing up with my parents being from Pakistan, and yeah, my dad really loved this country and was very much sort of like thought of himself as a kind of self-styled American, if you will, that nevertheless, it wasn't clear to me that I was not American or that I was American. I was just a kid in school, you know, and then I was a kid in college. And yeah, I was learning about a lot of things, but the question of identity was not really a central question to me. I knew that I had grown up with a kind of Muslim identity and that was somehow different than the identity of the folks around me, but it didn't seem to exclude me, at least not in their eyes, from some larger participation in the American experience, if you will. But when I went to Europe for the first time, that was when I started to understand that there was a set of givens, cultural givens, that I shared with other Americans. And that when I would meet Americans in Europe, there was, we are American. That it was really the first time that it was kind of self-consciously aware that I would yearn to read Harper's, or I wanted to read the Herald Tribune. I wanted to read what was happening in America because there was something about the way that we thought about politics or the kind of cultural references, just a cast of mind. The French were very different to me. I mean, I didn't really even understand the French or the Italians or the Germans, all countries where I lived for some time. And they were just so different. And the way that they thought about things was different, but I was American. And I think that differentiation of and coming to understand what are my points of view, or what is my point of view, is something that did happen gradually over the course of my many, many excursions away from America.
Yeah. There's this great essay by James Baldwin. The name is escaping me now, but basically he's living in France, he's living in Paris, and there's some kind of misunderstanding and he winds up in a French jail. And he says, I've never realized how American I was than being in a French jail, because as brutal as the American criminal justice system is, at least you share a common language with your jailers.
Right.
And he's like, I couldn't tell them I couldn't explain my side of the story, right? Not that people in jailers in the United States might have registered, but at least there was this kind of, and so it was almost visceral for Baldwin.
I think it speaks to what I do think is probably the deeper preoccupation or theme of the book of Homeland Elegies, which is that I think the book is an exploration of the social construction of the self. That the self is fashioned from the detritus and the texture and the networks of the society. You know, Plato talks about this when he says that the city is the metaphor for the soul, right? The city makes us. That is, the polis creates our interiority. It creates our being, and the tropes and the structures and the ways of thinking about ourselves are actually derived from our collective agreements. They're derived from our collective understandings. And so in a sense, the book is an exploration of what those collective things are, from which what are the threads that are creating this identity, which feels like it's me. It's not me. It's an expression of so many social givens.
What is happening to all of our souls in Donald Trump's America, right? That this,
you can comment on that.
No, Well, it's you putting language. I mean, you wrote a novel about this.
Yeah, yeah.
You wrote a novel about what happened to your father after being intoxicated by proximity to Donald Trump.
Yes.
What happened to his soul this is not a morality tale. It is a work of literature, but it is in effect reading, as you just said, it is reading where a nation is at back into
into the personal.
So I want to read you a passage from Philip Roth from an essay that I shared with you earlier. It's a great essay called "I Have Fallen in Love with American Names." It was published in the New Yorker in 2002. For those of you listening, I'd highly recommend you Google it and look it up and read it after Ayad and I are done here. But I want to read you a long passage from here to see how you relate to it. So.
Right.
And part of the reason I'm reading this to you is in some ways you say that you were shaped by Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and second half of the 20th century Jewish writers.
Yes.
So
and Seinfeld.
Who were they shaped by, right? Who was Roth shaped by? So here's what he says: the writers who shaped and expanded my sense of America were mainly small town Midwesterners and Southerners. None were Jews, meaning none were people like him. What had shaped them was not the mass immigration of 1880 to 1910, which had severed my family from the old country. What had shaped them was the industrialization of agrarian America, which caught fire in the 1870s and which, by providing jobs for that horde of cheap, unskilled immigrants, expedited the immigrant absorption into society. He goes on to say, I am a child of these writers. And a big part of what he does is, he says, through my reading, the mytho-historical conception of my country that I had developed in grade school from 1938 to 1946 began to be divested of its grandiosity and to unravel into the individual threads of American reality, the wartime tapestry that paid moving homage to the country's idealized self-image.
You take out the references to the war, and that could be a statement that I would try to make with, I hope, half as much eloquence about my book. That's exactly what I'm doing. It's exactly what the book is doing. I mean, it actually states that in the overture. It states some form of that, what I grew up with as America and how I came to understand it differently, in part because of a teacher I have named Mary, who figures throughout this book as a kind of Virgil figure for the narrator and also for the reader.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that. The line here that really struck me, in addition to Roth saying, I am a child of these writers. I'm a child of my Jewish parents in the Newark in lower middle class environment, but I am also a child of these writers, and these writers illuminate America to me. And then he says, he wants to apprehend the condition of being American. And as I told you earlier, I wrote that down, and then I forgot whether you had said it or he had said that. And I think you said, well, that's the highest compliment I could get is, is having a sentence, whether, is it me or Roth? So
I do. I mean, I've learned so much from reading Philip Roth, and I think the thing probably I learned the most, or the thing that I envied the most reading Philip Roth, and I take the envy part very, very seriously, because it tells me that it's something that I want to be able to do, something I want to be able to know how to do, was the kind of effortless translation of the texture of his mind and his consciousness into language on the page, so that you felt this intimacy in his best work. There's of course this endless complexity, endless understanding of American society and all of but there's also this effortless intimacy with the reader, that you feel like you are bathed in the brain fluid of the writer, that you really are inside his consciousness. And it was that is it feels so simple when you read it, but it is so difficult to pull off. I think it's the hardest thing to pull off.
Well, it's the fluency of the narrative. It's what makes the things that you write, both for the stage and in novel form, so readable. So you're reading it and it's so pleasurable, and you're being carried along by the narrative. And you look up at one point and you're like, oh my gosh, I see my country so much more clearly now, right? It's the simplicity on the other side of complexity, right? So I want to ask you something, kind of in relation to what you said 10 or 15 minutes ago about this novel is Ayad Akhtar's brain on simmer for 30 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I
20.
want to juxtapose that with, from the New Yorker article and from our personal friendship, what can only be described as like serial monogamy obsessions.
Yes, it's true.
Right. So like you become hyper religious as a kid, and then you're eating a ham sandwich with the New Yorker writer.
Yeah, right. She's a master of understatement, Alexandra, actually.
You like flip out over this, French or German or something like approach the theater, and you go and spend
Polish,
16 hours a day in these physically exhausting workshops where you all are like apparently staring and talking at a chair. Some that's probably minimizing it a bit, right?
Well, it's fine.
And then
it's not inaccurate.
My favorite line in the whole New Yorker profile, which, as I joked to you before, I imagine your publicist was like, please don't say anything like this. But here you are. I was reading too much Fernando Pessoa. Right? I mean, only you in your fashionably ripped jeans, right? In any case, the point that I'm making is when you narrate your past, it is this series of intense obsessions.
Yeah.
You rehearse No Exit with 3 actors for 8 months, and you never put it on the stage.
Wasn't ready.
Right? But then your magnum opus is a novel that is really the product of a 30-year simmer.
Yeah, and substantially the result of all of those obsessions, working my way through half the collected works of Freud. I remember in college, I wouldn't go out on Friday and Saturday nights. I'd spend all this time in the library, because, or I'd take books out and I'd go to the bar and I'd have some scotch, but then I'd be reading Freud. Because for a semester, that's all I did was read Freud. I just read Freud constantly. And then another, there was 2 other semesters. It was French. I had these cassettes and I was listening to French, all day long. My friends thought I was insane. And I was listening to it on the toilet. I was constant, but I skipped 4 levels of French in two semesters. I was in a graduate seminar, reading Flaubert in the original after, basically about a year. So it's just, I get into this, then it was Lacan, then it was Winnicott, then it was, Sufi tradition, then it was the Kabbalah. I mean, it's just, I get very, very preoccupied by something, and then it just kind of takes me over. Finance, I mean, for years and years, debt financing.
All the while, your parents are telling their friends, yes, he's studying to be a doctor. Yeah, internist.
Well,
yes.
No, they're trying to figure out what the hell, how to, my dad used to say, you should have become a lawyer. You can talk the monkeys out of the trees. Because every time they would try to have a conversation with me, I would have a response. I would have a very good, this is what I'm doing, and this is why it matters, and this is how it's going to help me, and all of that. Look, they were incredibly supportive for South Asian parents.
Yeah.
You know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
They didn't force me to do anything, which is a lot better than, a lot of my cousins and my friends, and and his dad told him, said, my dad wanted to become a mechanical engineer. He had an obsession with sort of fixing things, and he loved that. His dad said, you got to be kidding me, you bastard. He calls his own son a bastard. You bastard. You're going to be a doctor. You're the only son in the family. You're going to be a doctor. So my dad ended up going to medical school, and then became a kind of engineer of the heart, the plumbing of the heart. He became a specialist of the rhythms and all of that sort of stuff. So he found his...
Every time we let one of our kids, 10 and 13, talk us into something that we don't think that they should do, we're like, I look at my wife, I'm like, we are so assimilated. Like our parents would be like, are you crazy that you let your kid do that?
Yeah, and
because they wanted to.
And my parents did let me. I mean, that was the thing. My dad was a little bit. My mom was like, "What is he doing?" But eventually, my mom was very supportive too. So,
well, I mean, there's after a very tortured relationship between you, the narrator, and your father in the book, you end it really beautifully with him, right? Like you say, when he's back in Pakistan, I had a good life there in America, so many good years. I'm grateful to America. It gave me you, but I'm glad to be back in Pakistan. I'm glad to be home. And then, of course, in the coda, you say, you end the final paragraph with literally the opposite. You know, somebody says to you, they don't like your critique of America. An audience member basically says, go home. And you say, I've lived here my whole life, for better or for worse. I don't want to be anywhere else. I've never even thought about it. America is my home. Now, of course, there is a deep irony to that second to last sentence. I've never even thought about it, because you've just written 343 pages of, you spent 30 years thinking about it and given us 343 pages of clear and beautiful prose.
Well, that's the thing that it's wonderful about a novel. And I think maybe the first time I've had the craft and the confidence to both say a thing and negate it, to assert a meaning and undermine it at the same time. And between those two poles, right, that's life. Life is the current that moves between the opposites of negative and positive in the cathode, that's the current of life. And so being able to move across those poles vividly and energetically is, I think, what creates narrative energy. And so, yes, you picked up on the irony of the second to last sentence. Of course. What do you mean you never thought of it? We're just reading 350 pages of you thinking about it. Right. But it's convincing in that moment.
Is it fun to talk about it, or is it a chore?
It's fun to talk with you about it, I have to say. It's not always fun to talk about it. I mean, there's a copy that, people ask me what's real, what's not real. So then I have my whole thing that I go through, and I kind of try to make sure that I make a case for people to read it as a novel, that I'm asking them to hold it to a different standard of truth than the merely particular, than the merely anecdotal, however prurient, that I hope the tale accumulates an amplitude and a meaning that has a metaphorical dimension to it for them about America. So I have all of this stuff. As you can tell, I've been practicing this stuff. So I have this. This is less interesting to speak about this than to talk about some of the stuff we're talking about. So
I want to ask two more questions. One is, so your dad, American Muslim doctor, Trump supporter, right? And to a certain set of years, including mine, I'm like, that part's fiction, right? Except it appears that there's actually an increasing number of men of color who are supporting Donald Trump.
Right. And the two major characters in the book whose voting we know about, there's Mike Jacobs and the father character. They're both Trump supporters. And Mike Jacobs in the book is black. He's a black Republican, basically.
And I think there's a way that we speak of identity groups as ideological groups and not as demographic groups, right? Identities are, and so to be a person of color is to hold a worldview. It is not about the pigment or melanin in your skin. And it is clear from the data that Florida is increasingly in play because of Latino men. And the reason I bring this up is because I think one of the great advantages of the literary mindset is that it is willing to explore things that other mindsets, like my particular one right now about like what I think absolutely has to happen in American politics, and how you have to vote if you're of a certain identity background, right? Because is it not clear given the overt racism? Is it not clear given the Muslim ban? Is it not clear given comments about Mexican judges? Is it not clear, et cetera, et cetera? But here's your dad in the novel who, because he is 2 feet away from power, it's like, hey, he's a nice guy. And by the way, I kind of like the way he's in charge. And I felt at least it cast some light on how some other men might be approaching this, men of color. And I don't like to know that, but part of the job of the artist is to cast light on things that are real that we don't like.
Yeah.
Has that kind of clicked for you?
Yeah, I mean, totally. And I feel like I've not made any secret of my admiration for you, Eboo. I've been on the record talking about it. I think you're the best of what this country makes, is I think one of the things that I said about you once. An intellect as large as your heart, right? And I think that I understand what you're saying. I think having a political opinion, although it's difficult not to these days, given the insanity emanating from the White House, having a political opinion is a liability for an artist, I think, at the end of the day, at least the way that I see it. The great mentor for me is Shakespeare. You wouldn't know if Shakespeare was Catholic or if he was Protestant or if he was pro-power, or if he was pro the underclass. It depends on who he's writing at what moment. He's able to inhabit, you talk about multitudes, he's able to inhabit all of the multitudes. And when you're reading a perspective that Shakespeare is inhabiting, you are fully convinced that that is, of course, his point of view. And I think that as an artist, that's the place for me to be. The place for me to be is not to have political opinions about things in my work. The place to be is to be able to observe, embody, and imagine freely with great freedom. And that means imagining things that are, distasteful to some. There is politics in the book, and there is a political coming of age in this book, and there is a critique of a certain kind of rugged, on steroids, debt-fueled American individualism, right? That's all there. But again, it's not framed in a traditional political language, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, it's a domestic, it's in some ways it's about a writer coming of age and the various relationships he has.
Yeah.
The
various understandings of politics and the poll lists, as I was talking about earlier, that these people have had, his mentors, his parents, and what about them is American? What is it about the American polis? What defines it? What is it?
Yeah, what defines it? What defines it?
Level? Well, I think I think the narrator suggests that what defines it is race and money worship. That if you really boil it down, I think what he suggests, at one point, another character quotes Norbert Elias, who says that the dominant majority takes its they image of the despised outsiders from a minority of its worst and fashions its own we image from the minority of its best. So the majority is always making itself look better than it is by framing their self-image from the perspective of the minority of their best. And they're always looking at the outsiders and the minorities and saying, see, the worst of you is what you all are, right? And so what does the majority say? What is the minority of the best amongst the majority? Well, it's those who are white and those who have $1 billion. And that is so deep in the American psyche, is this expression of will par excellence is the making of money. And to not recognize that Donald Trump is playing that card, and that is fundamental to his rise in power, pretending to be a CEO for 14 seasons on The Apprentice, pretending to be a billionaire, this ersatz persona who embodies exactly that. What the majority thinks is the minority of its best when it comes to race and money. So I think that's what the narrator would suggest. I don't have an answer. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, part of what you and I, as an ongoing conversation that just became very clear when we talked before this conversation was, if you're a writer in the latter half of the 20th century, I mean, it is always the case that the most American characters are going to be African American, right? Like that is. I just think that has held true from the beginning and will long hold true, right? And every generation, there's an ethnic group that absorbs and kind of lives, in addition to African Americans, the definition of Americanness. And one of those in the latter half of the 20th century was Jews. And Bellow and Philip Roth and others had kind of, Bernard Malamud had approximate insight. What's that?
You keep leaving out Seinfeld and Larry David.
Yes, we'll include them. And And in the early part of the 21st century, it's Muslims, right? And it's so much the post 9/11 experience. And I want to kind of connect that to what you just said about the we continues to dominate by saying that the they, the minority, by pointing to the worst of that group, you are the 19 9/11 terrorists, you Muslims, right? All 1.5 billion of you, including the 5 million, you are those 19 people.
That's right.
And we are all Pat Tillman.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
We are all Pat Tillman.
Even though we are definitely not all Pat Tillman.
Right.
Decidedly not.
Right.
And yet we all are. Right. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, I don't want to press the case you're making for some exceptionalism of a Muslim experience post 9/11 as being somehow defining of the 21st century. Although I share it, I do believe that it's true, because I think the schism of 9/11 is fundamental to what we're dealing with now, right? And I think it's fundamental to what we're dealing with the collapse of the world order and the rise of an organized crime network that is the new global order. We're living in a world where the criminals are increasingly in power, and they will only continue to be. And that's across cultures, across the planet. There are deep structural reasons for it. And one of the fundamental fault lines of that is 9/11. So I do think that Muslims are situated because of foreign policy issues with the United States, and also because of a certain experience that they have had in this country, to be observers par excellence of the American experience in the 21st century. I think that they have a privileged, in a way, perspective, perhaps only rivaled or outpaced by Black American experience, which I think you're right, is always prescient and always relevant and always connected to the root of what it means to be American. So yeah, I'm not going to argue with it. I'm also not going to argue for it, although I just did. So
there's some great questions from our audience. So I want to begin with a direct one that connects directly to what we were just talking about, which is how do you think that the father's the character who is your father, who supports Trump, how does his immigrantness play into that? It's a question from Margarita.
Well, I think he believes that his immigrantness doesn't matter. He's American. America is a place where you define what you are. You say what you are. You say what bathroom you want to use. You say whatever you want. You are the person you decide to be. So he says, I am American. I'm not Muslim. I'm not going to be on a Muslim ban. I don't pray. I don't fast. What's the problem? I'm not a Muslim. I'm American. So it's a fundamental disjuncture and an inability to see the society that you're living in. But it's not unique to him. We all do it. We all do it at varying degrees, you know.
Several questions here about what's on your mind as we head into high political season. One questioner asked about specifically says, what's your prognosis for America? Another says, have you had any revelations as we move into high political season?
I think my arcane, if I was to let my mind run to the more arcane matters, I worry that we're evincing parallels with the late, early Augustan, late Republic, moment of the Roman Empire. And that's not promising. So, and I think that in a way, the sort of deeper administrative and institutional and really economic fundaments that have kept the country coherent, and that our power. I think something that folks don't often remember is that we've been a very powerful country for a long time, and we've had a lot of moral dilemmas, but we've been powerful. We've been central to the world order, and we have sustained and supported an international norm that has been perhaps not a perfect check and one we have taken advantage of, but nevertheless a check against naked cash politics. Naked cash politics is what's now taking over, and which is why increasingly criminals will be running the world, because you can deposit $100 million into a foreign finance minister's account and get what you want done. And there's no oversight, not from any judicial or any parliamentary organization, because the folks in power control the purse strings. We still reigned over a world order where there was that, whether it was the World Bank or the IMF or whether it was congressional oversight. Yes, we had to do some dirty things like Iran-Contra from time to time that wasn't going to pass muster. But for the most part, we did hold this together, and we were at the center. And us being at the center, yes, we abused power, but being at the center allowed and enabled so much for the American experience. As we retreat from the world, irrespective of our original sins and our peccadillos, I worry that the consequences are going to be so manifold and so significant, we can't even begin to fathom that really the much larger question is the lack of coherency as a nation and our ability to project power, be who we are, and have the space to wrestle with the things that we need to wrestle with, but to continue to be strong fundamentally economically. So it's not a particularly, it's not a particularly popular point of view right now to express this, especially as a person of color. It seems as if somehow I don't know, I'm discounting things. I'm not. I'm recognizing the importance of those things, and I'm also recognizing that there may be something even more important to our well-being as Americans.
Back to the personal, from the empire,
yes.
The not quite Pax Americana and its potential demise, back to the personal. So,
right.
We'll end with these two questions. So, do you think of the immigrant experience as hybridity, or do you think that's an outdated or inadequate term?
I mean, it has hybridity in it, but I think what a great question. I mean, that's such a profound question. I mean, I think it has hybridity in it, but I think, hybridity seems to imply there is something somehow fixed in its multiplicity with hybridity, right? And I think that, it's hard to make any real blanket statements about immigrant experience. I mean, obviously, me as a child of immigrants, I'm so different than so many of the kids that I grew up with who had similar backgrounds, and we all kind of find our way to what is meaningful to us. And so, yeah, sure, I would say yes, but it's maybe not it's maybe not a wide enough metaphor for what the immigrant experience is.
Last question. One that is asked with attention to Indian and Pakistani culture. What's the role of shame? How did the distinctive shame that is a part of those cultures play out in the novel, or as an undercurrent or as overt forces?
Well, I think it's an important part of the book, and I worried that this book would bring shame on some idea that folks would have about my family and me, frankly, but it seemed to me that in this era of shamelessness, in which the retreat of shame from whether it's, the interpersonal, that it's not just coming from the Oval Office, this is everywhere, and it's not right or left, and people don't seem to have much shame anymore. And I don't necessarily even mean it as a judgment, but as an observation. In this era of shamelessness, it seemed to me that there was no way to address what had happened to us without bringing shame onto my clan, if you will. I had no choice but to play the same game. I had to play the same game.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And how, knowing as you were writing that it wasn't just a chance. It was there was a version of it was going to happen.
Yeah. Right.
So, Ayad Akhtar, friend, American writer extraordinaire, wayward Muslim.
Yes. Ham sandwiches.
Read the novel Homeland Elegies. If you're going to read one novel, not just this year, but really, I think that gets to the essence of an era. Read Homeland Elegies. Salam, my friend Ayad. Thank you for being with me, with my community here in Chicago. Thank you for writing so beautifully about who we are as human beings and Americans.
This was so much fun. Thank you.